I'm delighted to be joined by Mariam Kintsurashvili, who is a strategic communications expert and especially focusing on the area of countering hybrid warfare. We're going to be talking about what's happening in Georgia and the efforts of Russia at state capture there. And of course, we're going to be talking about Moldova as well, where Russian operations to try to push the election result in their favor towards their puppet candidate has not quite worked out. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like this video. Once you get to the end of it, I know you will want to do that. Make sure you are subscribed to ensure you don't miss any great speakers and content. And as always, please do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. We've added some new ones recently. It's incredibly important to do this at this time. It's important to help Ukrainians remain resilient and to fight back Russian aggression, and not just Russian aggression, now North Korean aggression, which many of you will have seen. North Koreans turned up on the front, and they're starting to turn up in body bags as well. And lastly, thank you also to everyone who supported the channel by buying me a coffee or becoming a patron. It's massively important to keep the work of the channel going. This is the main thing that I do now, so it is tremendously helpful if you have done that. Thank you so much. Let's jump into these topics. Mariam, please do tell me a bit more about yourself and your key area of focus. I mentioned it's hybrid warfare, but I know there's a lot more detail underneath that.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's a great pleasure for me to be joining your channel, and I'm delighted with the work that you do for Ukraine. It's so important today. My main focus now as a Stratcoms expert is the security sector reform and cyber warfare, in particular the warfare led by Russia against the region and, as we see, against the whole civilized world. I've been actively involved in countering Russian false narratives before 2022 in my professional career, but since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I dedicated a large chunk of my time to help Ukraine with all the means I can as a professional. And this has been quite a process, a lot of learning, a lot of insights that I might haven't had working for the international organizations, a lot of dirt and pain that they cause. And I think it's our very strong responsibility as the representatives of the civilized world to be able to fight and let the world know what's really going on.
And we've got a bunch of questions about Georgia and Moldova, but the first question I wanted to ask is, and this is an interesting one, when I consume mainstream media, when I consume a lot of the narrative, and not necessarily sort of pro-Kremlin narrative, but there seems to be a broad impression that the war is localized to Ukraine, and that somehow when the war ends, things will return to normal, they'll become sort of, quiet, stable again. Anyone watching Russia like you do on a detailed basis and with a global view, this seems to be extremely delusional and naive. When the war in Ukraine ends, that's not an end of Russian aggression or hybrid aggression or even hot aggression, is it? How does this delusion come about, and why isn't the global angle of this conflict better understood?
This is an excellent question, and we've noticed this trend going on for quite a while. This is the goal of Russia's strategic plan, and the goal that Putin announced actually in his 2007 Munich speech, when he basically declared the Third World War on the civilized world. But the naivete of the West sometimes strikes me, like, when the villains tell you about their plans, you have to believe them because they tend to deliver on their promises. And this is the trend that is not only delusional and naive, it's very dangerous for the world. Like narrowing it down to the war in Ukraine is a very, very dangerous thing. because it's not only our region, the Eastern Neighborhood region, that is affected by Russia. Of course, like his main goal is to broaden the empire and to correct the mistake of, as he said, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union, by further expansionist ambitions. But as we see now, he is Putin and his allies and KGB, they are expanding their influence to the Central and Western Europe and across the ocean. And this year is very important because we had so many important elections in the world. And it's scary to see that almost everywhere, Russia has their own candidate that they favor. It's not only Georgia or Moldova or the countries of the Eastern neighborhood. It's gone far beyond. And if the West doesn't wake up, I don't know how this will end, because it's the war at the Russia at present seems to be winning.
And it's interesting, isn't it, observing Russian politics, because you assume that there must be something organic about it, that there must be some real voices there. But as you strip the layers away, either the layers of the onion or the layers of the matryoshka doll or whatever it is, you tend to realize that actually the entire thing is a puppet show. Every single candidate, even the ones that you thought were genuine, turn out to be either compromised, or they're full assets of the state, or they're coordinating with the state in some way. And in, say, the US election, there are actually multiple figures who are potentially compromised, or at least who are repeating Russian narratives. And for me, at least, that's a signal that there's something going on. We may not be able to explicitly say exactly what it is. You have Trump, of course, who has repeated Russian narratives. Tucker Carlson isn't running, but he's a key part of it. You have Kennedy Jr., who is probably one of the worst examples of conspiracy theory peddling, which ties very much into Russian operations. You have Jill Stein, who cannot bring herself to criticize Vladimir Putin. So it's not just one candidate, it's actually a choir of pit voices. So it seems that that technique has been exported to other places. Is that the same in Georgia and Moldova?
Absolutely. I love your comparison with the matryoshka because it's so multi-layered, and that's why it's so hard to capture. And what Russia is doing, and they've been doing it historically since the Soviet times, they are weaponizing democracy against us. And they have the dictators of the world, they have the luxury that the civilized world has lost. They have dozens of years of strategic planning ahead. And this operation that's become so obvious now, especially post the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it's showing how long time ago it was pre-planned by Russia. And certainly they started with us, with the nearest neighborhood. I will give the Georgia's example. And first, all the separatist movements in the region in the 90s, which were artificially created by Russia, such as Abkhazia and Samechablo, which they call South Ossetia region, and Transnistria in Moldova, Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. These separatist movements were artificially created back in the Soviet times, and they erupted in the 90s when the Russians, they tried to keep their controls of our region. And then 2008 came. And this was the real start of this hybrid new way of leading the warfare. And this was basically the start. Some call it the Cold War II, some call it the World War III, and Putin definitely sees it this way. Because when the award ceremony was held in Kremlin post 2008 war in autumn, I think, the main persons given military decorations, military awards, were journalists. And they were called our soldiers of the information front. That's when it started. It was successfully tested in 2008 in Georgia, and then it was capitalized in 2014 with an annexation of Crimea and creation of quasi-republics, Народные Республики of Donbass. And they continued doing it because they were never stopped. They were appeased. Unfortunately, post-2008 war, the deals were done by Germany and France with Russia. The subsequent famous reboot of America-Russia relations happened, and it emboldened Putin. He understands only the language of power, but the civilized world keeps just appeasing, and this is not the way out. And my fear is that the West is losing us. The West is losing Eastern neighborhood, and this is getting very serious. And the last elections in Moldova and whatever was going on in Georgia for the past 12 years show this direction very vividly.
And there are other places as well which are of concern: Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia. There are even Austria, dare I say it. There are various places which are, I would say, going soft on Russia, and created some sort of rot behind the bark, as it were, of European defense. Those frontline states, which are a little bit more, Putin would call them Russophobic, but those who understand Russia a little bit better, such as Romania, Poland, Ukraine, etc., the hard bark, the defense against Russian aggression. But let's turn to what actually can work, because we saw in Maidan that mass protests that bring together a broad spectrum of opposition, and where people can actually sort of coordinate and self-organize at tremendous scale, that does actually work against Russian hybrid warfare. And it's it has been proven to be ineffective when you can really mobilize people. It also helps to show up the narratives and their hollowness and the illusions behind Russian narratives. In Georgia, can we compare what's happening now to Maidan, or is the sort of depth of the protests, is it not quite at the same scale? Does it not reach the same threshold as, say, Maidan? Are there causes for concern there about whether it can win? I mean, we saw in Belarus tremendous protests, but of course the regime won out. What's happening in Georgia, and what's the sort of state of the protests?
In terms of self-organization and the strengths of civil society, I would certainly compare it to Maidan. And actually, as you said, the biggest fear that Putin has is colored revolution. He's obsessed with them, and he's obsessed with stopping people's voice by any means he can. And like the level of self-organization of civil society in Georgia strikes me, and it makes me really, really happy. Because when they first introduced the law on foreign agents, agents of foreign influence, the so-called Russian law in 2023, people came out, and they were not organized by any political party, because opposition in Georgia is quite fragmented and not as strong as we would want to see them. So people self-organized. They went out, and people were really, really happy that our president, Zelenskyy, stood on our side. Although, according to the Constitution, president doesn't have much power in Georgian politics, but she has the power to advocate for our voices within the international community, and she delivered it amazingly. So in 2023, we won. The world heard our voice. They took back that bill on foreign agents, and it emboldened civil society, because before that, the attitudes were quite cynical and nihilistic. So especially the younger generation, they realized that their voice matters and it can bring the change. And it was very uplifting time, and we were granted candidate status, and people were celebrating in the streets. It was beautiful. And then the Georgian Dream regime, because I cannot call them the government, they reintroduced the law, and we've seen even bigger protests in 2024. But they shifted a bit to a Lukashenko mode with the violent crackdowns of the protests. However, these elections gave us hope. So we stopped the process in spring, the protests in spring, hoping that united opposition under the Georgian charter created by President Zelenskyy would actually win and would bring opposition into power, or at least strip the Georgian Dream of the constitutional majority, which is catastrophic for the country. The elections were stolen, they were rigged. It was not the elections, it was the Russian special operation that they called their elections. They were by no means free and fair, and there is no way that they should be legitimized. So on Saturday, 8 p.m. Georgian time, when the exit poll results were announced, civil society, people were celebrating because they showed that a united opposition won by a very serious margin. And for 1 hour, we had this moment of hope and celebration. And then the Central Elections Commission, they announced that the numbers that they drew for themselves, which were over 14% above what the exit polls were showing. And that's when we realized that they rigged the elections. Certainly we expected that, but we didn't expect that scale. And next day, people took it to the streets, and it was a massive protest in the center of Tbilisi, where president participated and all opposition parties were united. And the plan was that the local observer organizations and civil society and independent media would provide the evidence of the level of falsifications. So the whole week they were gathering the evidence, and it's thousands and thousands of photos, video materials, text messages, a lot of undercover work by the Georgian journalists, which have to be given medals for whatever they do for our European future. And it turned out that this falsification was even worse than anyone could have expected. We had high hopes for it because it was the first time when the electronic machines, both electronic counting machines for the elections were introduced. And there was the hope that with the electronic counting, they would be less prone to falsification, which turned out to be not true, because it was a very well pre-planned special ops where people were renting their IDs 2-3 months in advance, as the investigation revealed by the local observers and the journalists. This was done specifically to put the data from those IDs in the counting machines beforehand. And this shows that the Central Elections Commission was heavily involved, because without them, it couldn't have been done. In parallel with this huge carousel, we have all traditional methods of vote buying, bribery, transportation, illegal transportation of the voters to the polling stations, horrible intimidation tactics, especially in the regions heavily populated with the national minorities, physical violence against observers, although this time it was much less than we are used to, and it also has its reasons. one of the reasons would be the violence against observers was used this time to distract attention, to make the carousel, I don't know this term in English, but the merry-go-round of this election, rigged election work. So the tactics, the multi-layer tactics that they used this time are very similar to what was happening in Moldova, and we can make parallels here. The only advantage of Moldova was that the diaspora could vote freely. And that, like, I will give you the comparison of the polling stations abroad. Moldova had 220 polling stations for their citizens abroad to be able to cast the vote. Georgia had 60. And this was made on purpose by the Georgian government to suppress the vote of our immigrants who, in their absolute majority, vote for our European choice. And they know that abroad they couldn't rig elections the way they did it in country, especially in the regions. And they made sure to suppress the diaspora vote as much as they could. So the suppression happened in two ways. One was pre-election, when they opened the minimal number of polling stations. Like, for example, Moldova had 60 stations in Italy, and we had 60 in total. And this is very, very unfortunate. But during the election day, around 100,000 people abroad registered to vote. Only 34,900 managed to cast their vote. They stood in queues sometimes for 8-10 hours just to cast their vote. These people would travel 2,000 kilometers to be able to express their will and to confirm their choice, but they were stripped of this constitutional right. So yeah, this would be the difference between Moldova and Georgia. And I'm really, really happy for Moldova. Yesterday I was celebrating. I just came back from Chisinau and I was congratulating some friends and colleagues there, because this is a big step forward. It's like the main battle is still ahead for them, the parliamentary elections, and Russia will do everything to win in these really crucial elections for Moldova. But I think the low margin in the EU referendum was kind of a wake-up call for Moldovan government and the law enforcement. And I think the huge role in exposing this scheme is the role of investigative media and civil society in Moldova, where they managed to expose those dirty schemes that were applied by local kleptocrats and their Russian masters. So hopefully Moldova will be better prepared for their parliamentary election, and it will be a good lessons learned for the West too, because this is the testing ground for the Russians. And I urge the West to understand this sooner rather than later.
And this is something we talk about on the channel a lot, which is, Russia has used this phrase for many years, which is political technology. And I don't think we paid sufficient attention to that, the terms political technology and color revolutions. And these were accusations leveled at the West that this is what we're doing to disrupt, countries within Russia's so-called sphere, or its perceived sphere. I think it's quite obvious now that this is a process of projection, that actually Russia sees democracy as a kind of political technology that can be hacked, and then rewired to its own advantage. And in terms of Georgia, it seems that many institutions of state have been hacked in this way as part of this process of state capture. You mentioned the Electoral Commission there. How on earth can the electoral results, the falsified electoral results, be overturned or challenged at the very least, when so many institutions of state seem to have been turned into zombie institutions by this Russian process of political technology or state capture?
This is an excellent point. I think they almost finalized, Russia almost finalized the state capture of the Georgian state. As you said, there is no institution left except maybe for Georgian military, who always try to stay neutral and far from politics, and the president, but she has like a few weeks left of her term, and then there will be no elections. The parliament will just appoint their puppet as a president and as a representative of Georgia on the global diplomatic sphere. So the state capture happened. The opposition immediately called the results of this rigged election as an attempt for a constitutional coup, and I tend to agree with them. This is a total usurpation of power by feudal Vedina Ivanishvili. What can be done is people need to stand up for their rights. People need to stand up for our future, because if it's not done now, I don't think we will get the chance. But with that, we need a strong support from the West, not just expression of grave concerns and all these words which everybody in this region, especially Ukraine, are really tired of. We need clarity, we need decisive actions, and we need true support. The perpetrators need to be punished. We need punitive measures from the EU, but they need to be targeted, not at us, the civil society and the Georgian public, but at those who play by the Russian playbook. So this is the most important. To continue the protests, we need fuel. I mean, ideological and moral fuel. The one that we need to be sure that we have the West's back. And for now, I don't see it. It's a bad timing. I understand that it's crucial elections in the US, and a lot is going on, and there is a war fatigue. I'm really tired of this term war fatigue with Ukraine, because Ukraine is serving as a shield for all the rest of the civilized world. And we owe them not to be fatigued by this war.
When we're not doing the
But
fighting, it's an odd concept, isn't it?
absolutely. And Georgians, they understand it, like the Georgian Legion is, and many of other Georgian battalions, is the most numerous in terms of foreign representation among the Ukrainian fighters, because we understand that Ukrainian victory will guarantee us the victory. And we are a small country, we cannot do much, but we are doing everything that we can. And Georgian Dream regime is doing everything to stop us from doing that.
And one of the big challenges, of course, is the main oligarch, the main instrument of Russia's influence, the man behind Georgy Dream, who is Bindiza Ivanishvili. His scale of his wealth and the percentage of the economy that he actually is under his personal control is almost unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah, it's striking for such a small country. And Prytula Ivanishvili is the face of these political technologies that Russia applies. A very interesting figure. He comes from a humble background, from a Georgian village, and then all of a sudden he makes this enormous fortune in Russia in the 90s, and we all know how such fortunes were made in the 90s in the bandit Russia. And then he disappears, and then he reappears in Georgia as a philanthropist. Nobody sees him in the beginning of 2000s. Like, I worked as a very young journalist, and I remember there were legends about how he saved our botanical garden, how he saved this and how he saved that, and nobody could even catch him because he was so humble that he didn't want to reveal himself. And at that time, it seemed really weird to me. And then 2011, fast forward, he creates his political party, Georgian Dream. And that's when many of us started ringing the alarm bells that something is not right here. But at that time, we were called Russophobic, fear-mongers, etc. Saakashvili was punished for voicing his concerns. But there was a democratic transfer of power in 2012, which was the first time in Georgian history, and we were certainly praised for that. And by inertia, everything went really well for their first term, but there were some red flags that people inside and outside of Georgia tried to close their eyes on. Georgian Dream, they came to power as a coalition of a number of political parties that opposed the United National Movement, at that time the ruling party of Mikhail Saakashvili. So they are not all pro-Russian, because you cannot be pro-Russian in Georgia, in a country where over 80% of population, and sometimes up to 92, at different times support the integration, the Euro-Atlantic integration. You cannot explicitly say that you are pro-Russian. And up until now, the Georgian Dream doesn't do that. They are very smart not to alienate their own base by declaring their full support and their full 180-degree turnaround towards Russia. So, as I'm sure you know about the term crawling occupation of Georgia, what Russia does since 2008, and it's a very, very sad to see it with your own eyes, how they just move these barbed wires through the gardens and orchards of old people that are still left in those border villages. That's the physical crawling occupation and grabbing of the land by Russians, but we have the crawling occupation of the Georgian Dream in Georgian information sphere. So they started off really carefully, and for years they were praised by the European partners, but then little by little you could see here and there, they would crack down on some independent media and would get away with that. They would bring in Russian MPs like Gavrilov and get away with that, and get away with subsequent violent crackdown on the protests that followed. We let them get away with a lot, and the West let them get away with a lot until it was too late, because in 2022, to many people it came as a surprise that the Georgian Dream is actually not the pro-EU and pro-Euro-Atlantic integration, but more of a pro-Russian. But they were pro-Russian from the beginning. Even some of their supporters and some of the members of their coalition didn't realize it at the time. But after their first term, many alienated and distanced themselves from the Georgian Dream, and now today they are in opposition. But this is the excellent example how political technology worked and how incorporated with the classical propaganda messaging, they managed to succeed. Because, let's be honest, they have their own base. It's not 40%, because 40% is also inflated by intimidation tactics and vote buying, and especially using of administrative resource, but they have their good solid 20-25%, and most of those people, unfortunately, are deceived by the propaganda messaging that they are getting from the Georgian Dream. Very similar situation is in Moldova and across the region. It's mainly EU equals LGBT. They want to get rid of our traditional values, family values. So they want to destroy the Orthodox Church. Don't poke the Russian bear. It's very similar in Moldova and Georgia too. Like Maya Sandu is poking the Russian bear. Opposition wants a second front in Georgia. This very unique message for Georgia, the Global War Party, a
They
conspiracy
featured that in the
theory
election,
that,
didn't they? I mean, they had photos of
yes,
Mariupol, which was absolutely disgraceful, suggesting that, if you vote for the opposition, this is what you're inviting. You're inviting a Russian invasion. In fact, we see some similar messaging used in the US election, which is vote for Kamala Harris, you vote for the idea of global war, which is ironic because Russia is conducting a global war. Um,
uh, it works because it's based on fear, and this is the strongest emotion Russia's always appealed to. These banners were absolutely disgraceful. I can't even believe up until now how in the Georgians in Tbilisi streets you could see such kind of banners, because Tbilisi is historically very supportive of Ukraine. One of my friends, Georgian friends, she went to Lviv, and I love Lviv, and I asked her, so what are your impressions about Lviv? And she said, it's very similar to Tbilisi, but they have less Ukrainian flags in the streets. So you can see the overwhelming support of Georgian population towards Ukraine, and at the same time, those atrocious banners, which this is a crime to exploit such a painful topic of war, especially with Ukraine, because Ukraine has always been our partner and like brother nation, and we share a lot of pain together. So this was something that even for Georgian Dream regime was hitting the rock bottom. But this fear narrative, it works. It worked in Moldova. Like I recently, during my visit, I discovered that there is a lot of brain drain because young people, they tend to leave the country because of the fears of starting the war, and pro-Russian candidates, they actively exploit this topic. So it's very common everywhere. And as you said, globally, especially in the United States, like they scare you with the atomic bomb, which always works. So Russians don't need to spend a lot of brain energy on coming up with this messaging. But the big advantage of Russia that they know the audience. They can feel the audience, and they know what the audience needs and what the audience fears. The biggest disadvantage of the West is that they don't. And I don't want to be very critical of the EU countering disinformation programs, but there is a trend of being very reactive, debunking myths, debunking small, false narratives of Russia. But this is too late. Like all this debunking happens in a bubble, and we congratulate each other on, as experts, on excellent reports. We pat each other's shoulders. But the message was out in the air, on TikTok, on X, and people consumed this message. Whatever you debunk doesn't mean a lot to that audience. And this is something very important that we need to learn. We need to read the audience, and we need to give the audience what it needs, which Russia does extremely successfully.
This is it. Well, you've put your finger on the very reason for this channel existing, which is you have to create an alternative set of narratives, get ahead of, Russian efforts, almost inoculate people as in a vaccine, because that's the only way you're going to, enable people to see through this sort of stuff when it arises. But again, the challenge there is mass audience, as always, how you can engage as many people as possible. And there's an interesting aspect as well, of course, what's happening in Georgia. There is a huge community of displaced Russians. Is there an attempt by Moscow to weaponize this population? Are they, broadly speaking, neutral? Are they actually an asset to Georgia Dream? Or are they perhaps a risk to it? And what's likely to happen in that event if the Russian diaspora population are either a risk or an opportunity to weaponize? How might Georgia Dream actually collaborate with Russian intelligence services to monitor, target, utilize this community of displaced Russians? Or if any of them are actually sort of protesting to harass them?
This is an excellent question, and this has been something I was really actively talking to about on different platforms, but there is not enough attention paid to that. Absolutely, they can be used against us. It is in the Russian foreign policy doctrine, the compatriots abroad concept, which they have abused for a while now in 2008 in Georgia, in Donbass, with all the false narratives on the Ukrainians killing Russian-speaking babies, etc., etc. So this is the part of their compatriots abroad doctrine. However, I don't think that all of them are part of it, all of the representatives of Russian diaspora. I would say that those who came after 2014 war, they are more oppositionally inclined, and they just want to be away from dictatorship. Those who came immediately when the full-scale invasion started, some of them are ideologically motivated, which is a good thing, but many of them just did it for financial reasons. And then the September batch, like the second wave of Russian exodus, as they themselves call it, to Georgia and Armenia and other countries of the region, it's mostly men who wanted to evade conscription. So with the last one, because it was the most massive and there were a lot of concerns among civil society, NGOs, and opposition parties, because they would just let them through the land border, the Ministry of Interior, without any kind of profiling. So we don't have data, and the Ministry of Interior, they closed the statistical data, and since then, it's just they make it public only once a year in some very vague report. So we don't know the exact numbers, the exact profile of those entering. As for the research that was put into it, I'm a little bit skeptical of the research available because most of it was done by the Russians themselves. And I tend not to trust Russians, even oppositionally inclined. As you said, that with the time, it's like a matryoshka doll. It's like the layers of the onion. When you peel them off, you can see that this or that person is actually repeating FSB narratives and Putin's narratives. So you never know with them. You never can trust them. All these good Russians talks are a little bit irritating, especially when you see the whatever Russians are doing with the war in Ukraine, and you see such big figures as Navalny's wife giving very mixed messaging. As per research that was made, the majority of Russians who now reside in Georgia and form the diaspora are younger people, IT professionals, are involved in some businesses. They are not political, majority of them is not politically active. Those who were, they used Georgia as an intermediary station and then they moved to the West. this is a different situation from Armenia, because in Armenia we have the Russian diaspora who is quite politically active. It consists of civil society representatives, lawyers, journalists, and they continue their work. So those one would be more interesting if we talk about weaponizing them against against Russia and in our war against Russia's false narratives. There is a concern that the Russian diaspora in Georgia could be participating in the schemes of evading sanctions, which more and more reports on this topic are coming, like using transportation companies, couriers to deliver dual-use goods to Russia through the third countries, from countries like Turkey or United Arab Emirates, through third countries like Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, some countries of the Central Asia. So I tend to believe that this might be the case with some representatives of diaspora. At the same time, if we look at it from economic perspective, a majority of those who came to Georgia are well-off middle-class Russians. So naturally, they raised the price for real estate, for rent. They own now some districts in Tbilisi and Batumi, which is also really concerning. And they create their own businesses, their own private kindergartens, schools. So they tend to stick together, which is also not good in terms of economy. What else? There is a huge economic security issue here, because when they tend to buy real estate, they will get an easier access to the residency permit and subsequently possibly citizenship and the right to vote, which nobody is talking about now because it's too far away and strategic, but in the next elections, they could become electorate in Georgia, and it's not hard to guess who they would vote for because they were given such favorable conditions in Georgia. So there is a lot of concern. There are a lot of concerns when we talk about diaspora and how they could be weaponized against Georgia. But it's important to look at what Putin says and what they have written into their legislation. They are his compatriots abroad. They are the part of the Russian world. They are the part of Russosphere, which he promised to protect. So they can be certainly used against us.
I've got two questions left, really, to sort of try and unpack this topic, although we could potentially talk for hours on this. One is, you mentioned sort of, the strength of feeling in Tbilisi, and a lot of the protesters are focused on Tbilisi, at least the media coverage is, when it is covered by the media, that's a whole other topic there, unfortunately. But how strong is popular protest outside of Tbilisi in other towns, cities, and villages, or do people tend to come in from those places in order to, swell the numbers in the capital, or is it more of a sort of urban phenomenon, this sort of understanding of what's going on around the election falsification?
Many tend to come to Tbilisi, and that's when we're talking about the self-organization of people, like all those groups creating on different social media channels, they proved how important this self-organization is, because people would transport each other to participate in the protests. They would host and house some of the people from the regions to stay a night or two during the protest. They would pet sit, babysit. It was amazing to watch that community spirit that unleashed on those social media pages, and it was really heartwarming. Same happened during the elections, because many people who work in Tbilisi, they are officially registered in the regions, so they needed transportation, and a lot of fundraising was done by ordinary people to help people buy fuel, organized transportation, because certainly the Georgian Dream organized transportation only for their voters. And yeah, that's why Tbilisi tends to be the center of it, but the protest mood in the region is also high, especially in the big cities. Even with the rigged elections, even with the stolen voices, the Georgian Dream still didn't manage to win all major cities in Georgia. They lost to the united opposition in Tbilisi, Kutaisi, Batumi, etc. So the cities certainly, it's a little bit of a geographic, generational, and urban versus rural thing. Especially in the regions that are heavily populated by ethnic minorities, and this is a very sad thing. They managed to manipulate the most, and media investigation shows the schemes that were working in the regions. And this is, I might criticize the opposition a little bit on this front, because there is a false belief, partly false belief, that regions that are populated by ethnic minorities tend to vote for the party in power. And during 30 years of independence, nothing really has been done to make them feel important in the life of society, to make them feel included in the civil society life of Georgia. Certainly, there are some really brilliant activists from the regions, representatives of ethnic minorities who do an amazing job, but there is not much interest in them from the opposition. It's very interesting that there is one party, opposition party, but not very prominent, that got a lot of Armenian vote in Tbilisi. And when the voters were asked why, they said because the number 6 on the list is one of ours. So it was a prominent Armenian public figure. They need to be included, and no funding has ever been spent on trying to incorporate and include ethnic minorities in the dialogue. And this is the lesson that should be learned from this election. On the other side, the government, they put a lot of funding in bribing people there, in intimidating, and like they would use different tactics that incorporated a fear factor, such as like, we will cut off electricity or gas in your village. We will, like, there were threats to people's health and well-being. So they used a combination of tactics, and the opposition had nothing to offer from their side. So this is something that would be a good lesson for the future. But in general, civil society is united. Regions are standing with Tbilisi, but Georgia is a small country, so it's hard to gather huge masses of people in each and every region. And it's also a financial factor is working as well. And as we see, like, people are fundraising and self-organizing by themselves, and we are not the richest country in the world. And but yesterday, during another major rally that happened yesterday evening, the opposition announced that they are the opposition announced civil disobedience and permanent protest that will center in Tbilisi and then will spread to the region. So we will see how it evolves in the coming days and weeks.
And the last question, this is probably a relatively simple one. And what are the implications for the falsification of the election on the Georgian candidacy for the EU? Is that process now effectively in suspension? Is there any way it can move forward while there is this suspicion that the government lacks legitimacy?
The process is definitely frozen, as is the most of funding towards Georgia, especially bilateral programs between the governments, especially in security and national security and defense sphere, which adds a lot dangers to the future and to susceptibility of Georgia to Russian threats. So some programs in cybersecurity, in defense, in law enforcement, capacity building are basically frozen now. Same for the chances for the EU accession. We've been warned many times after they passed the bill on the agents of foreign influence that this will have consequences. And the government basically ignored it, and whoever was making these statements, they would add them to the global war party. They went as far as to add the whole EU Parliament, EU Commission, the United States administration, current administration, and the Congress to the global war party, together with our civil society and journalists and opposition politicians, and certainly Ukraine. So basically the process is stopped. And that's why it's important to continue the protest to show the world that Georgian government doesn't reflect the opinions and the choice of Georgian people, which is like basically Georgian Dream's goal. They are now in kind of a win-win situation because if the protests continue, they can go full Lukashenko mode and violently crack down, and then they will be sanctioned. And then they will open more field to Russian propaganda. Look, Europe has abandoned you, and now we have no other choice but to turn to Russia. Or the protests, like the sparkle will like go down a little bit, and less people come, and God forbid the people kind of accept the legitimacy of the new parliament. And then it's also a good message for the Georgian Dream to the West that, look, the people made their choice. And at the same time, it will be an internal message that, because the EU certainly will sanction us and there will be really strong punitive measures, and the message will be the same. Look, they abandoned you, and now we have no other choice to turn to Russia. But this is important to understand that it's not only Russia, it's China becoming a big player in the region. And as opposed to the wild conspiracy of the global war party, the concept of the axis of evil is very real. And we are becoming another battleground there in the region, and Black Sea region is very strategic. Georgia, whole Transcaucasus, but Georgia in particular is the major economic hub for East and West. And the question is the West ready to give up on us?
There's so many deeply fascinating issues there, and of course they're playing out in near real time as we speak on multiple fronts. So we will continue to cover that. We'll continue to cover what's happening in Georgia on this channel, even though the mainstream media does not seem to be inclined to follow this story in the depth and detail that's required. Mariam, thank you so much for the work you do. Thank you so much for coming on the channel. It's been deeply fascinating, and you've touched on so many important issues. I'm sure the audience will join me in their gratitude for you coming on the channel and explaining all these things.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan, and thank you for giving platform to Georgian voices, and the voices from the region is crucially important for us. We don't get the attention that we need, and thank you for spreading the word. Thank you.